The evening had that quiet stillness that only comes when something deep inside you already knows the change is near. I stood by the window, looking at the faint lights outside, waiting for my husband to return. It had become a habit, waiting for him, waiting for his voice, waiting for a sign that things between us were still alive. But lately, our home had turned into nothing more than walls and furniture, filled with silence that used to be laughter. When he walked through the door that night, I could sense something different in his expression. He didn't smile or ask how I was. He just said calmly, "Some friends from college are coming over tonight." His voice was steady, almost emotionless. I nodded, hiding the nervousness that began to rise in my chest. It wasn't the visit that bothered me, it was his tone, the way he said it, as if the decision had already been made long before I was told. I spent the next hour preparing. The dining table was set neatly, candles placed carefully, and soft music played in the background. I wanted everything to be perfect, not because I cared about the guests, but because a part of me still believed that maybe, just maybe, he would see my effort and remember how much I cared. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath. 3 men entered, all polite and friendly at first glance. They greeted me warmly, but something about their eyes felt uncertain, as if they weren't sure how to behave. My husband followed behind them, his face calm, unreadable. He didn't introduce them properly, he simply said, "They're old friends. Make them comfortable." Then he sat down, quietly observing. As I served the tea, I tried to start light conversation. The men asked about the house, about life in the city, about small things that didn't matter. But every time I glanced at my husband, I felt uneasy. He wasn't engaging with them the way friends normally would. He just watched them, watched me, and said very little. It was as if he was analyzing every movement, every word. The air inside the house began to feel heavier. The laughter of the guests sounded forced, their smiles fading quickly after each sentence. My husband's silence filled the space between us, and no one dared to question it. I poured more tea, my hands trembling slightly as I did. The sound of the spoon tapping against the cup felt louder than usual, echoing in the tension that had settled in the room. At one point, one of his friends asked, "You two seem to have a peaceful life here." My husband's lips curved into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Peaceful," he repeated softly. "Yes, you could call it that." The way he said it made me stop in my tracks. There was something unsettling behind his words, something cold that I couldn't name. The night dragged on slowly. Every moment felt stretched, as though time itself had begun to move differently. My husband didn't speak much, but I could feel his gaze following me, calm yet piercing. When I caught his eyes once, he looked away immediately, pretending to adjust his watch. The gesture was small, but it said everything. There was distance between us, an invisible wall that I hadn't noticed growing over the years, and now it stood tall and unbreakable. When I finally sat down, pretending to listen to the conversation, my mind wandered. I remembered the man he used to be, the one who brought me flowers just because, who laughed at my clumsy cooking, who stayed up late telling stories about his dreams. That man had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by this quiet stranger sitting across from me. The guests didn't stay late. Around 11, they began to say their goodbyes, their voices low, their smiles uneasy. My husband stood up, shook their hands, and followed them to the door. I stayed behind, cleaning the table slowly, pretending not to notice how none of them looked back as they left. When the door finally closed, silence returned. My husband stood still for a moment, then turned toward me. His face was calm, his tone gentle. "You did well," he said softly. I didn't know what he meant by that, and before I could ask, he walked past me and went straight to the bedroom. I stood alone in the dim light, the ticking clock echoing in the background. Something inside me told me that tonight was not about old friends or casual visits. It was about something deeper, something I hadn't yet understood. And though the evening had ended, I could feel it. Our story had just begun to unravel. The night after they left, the house felt different. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, as if every wall had absorbed the tension that no one had spoken about. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept replaying my husband's expression, the way he'd sat there, silent, watching everything with a strange calmness. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something about that evening had been staged. It hadn't felt like a casual visit among friends. It had felt like a test, but I didn't know what I was being tested for. The next morning, I woke up early and began cleaning the house. Every plate, every chair, every corner felt like it carried the echoes of that uncomfortable night. My husband sat at the table, drinking tea quietly. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask if I had slept. His silence had become a language of its own, and I was tired of trying to translate it. "Your friend seemed nice," I finally said, hoping to start a conversation. He looked up at me slowly and gave a faint smile. "They're old friends," he said simply, and then looked back down at his cup. The calmness in his tone bothered me more than anger ever could. I wanted to ask what he meant by "you did well last night," but I was afraid of the answer. The days that followed were strangely quiet. My husband spent most of his time at work or sitting in the living room, lost in thought. Sometimes, I caught him staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. Not with affection, not with hate, just watching. It made me uneasy, but I didn't know how to confront him. One evening, as I was folding clothes, I found an old photo album lying on his desk. It was filled with pictures of his college days, smiling faces, laughter, parties. Among them, I recognized the same friends who had visited us that night. I stared at their happy faces and wondered how those same men could have looked so tense, so uncertain, when they were here. Something about the past and present didn't fit together. When he came home that night, I asked softly, "Were they the ones you used to be closest to?" He nodded. "We went through a lot together," he said, his voice distant. I hesitated, then asked, "So why did they seem uncomfortable?" He looked at me for a moment, then said something that froze me. "Because they finally saw the truth." His words were calm, but they carried a strange weight. I wanted to ask what truth he meant, but he had already walked away. That night, I sat alone in the dark, the words echoing in my head. What truth? What had he shown them? I tried to remember every detail of that evening, the way they looked at him, the way he watched me, the silences between their questions. The realization slowly began to sink in. He had wanted them to see something, and whatever it wasn't about friendship. The next few days became unbearable. I couldn't focus on anything. His behavior remained the same, quiet, controlled, distant. Sometimes he'd look at me as though I was a character in a story he already knew the ending to. There was no warmth, no fight, no emotion left between us. One night, as I served dinner, I finally gathered the courage to ask, "What happened that night? Why did they come here?" He didn't answer immediately. He kept eating, slowly, as if deciding whether I deserved the truth. Then, without looking up, he said, "They needed to see who I really am." His answer made even less sense, but I didn't push further. Deep down, I realized it wasn't just me he had been testing, it was himself. Maybe he wanted to prove something, not to me, but to the people who once knew him best. But what he had proven, I still didn't know. When I went to bed that night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of his cold eyes haunted me. It felt as if I was living with a stranger, someone who wore my husband's face but carried none of his love. The silence between us had grown so thick that even the smallest sound, a ticking clock, the rustle of curtains, felt louder than words, and in that silence, one thought echoed endlessly in my mind. Sometimes betrayal doesn't come from a single act, it comes from the quiet distance of someone who has already stopped caring. The following week passed in slow motion. Every morning, the same silence greeted me, the same half-finished cups of tea, the same empty look in my husband's eyes. We spoke only when necessary, our words short and polite, as if we were strangers sharing a house rather than a life. The laughter we once had seemed like a memory from another world. One evening, I noticed him sitting in the living room, staring at nothing. The TV was on, but the volume was low. I sat across from him, gathering courage to speak. "Are you angry with me?" I asked quietly. He looked at me, surprised by the question, then gave a faint smile that felt more sad than kind. "No," he said softly. "I'm not angry. I've just been thinking about everything." "About what?" I asked, hoping for a real answer. He leaned back, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling. "About truth," he said. "About how people live years together pretending everything is fine, when deep down, they know it isn't." His tone was calm, but it carried something sharp underneath. I didn't know whether he was talking about us or about himself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering all the moments that had led us here, the long days, the quiet dinners, the smiles that no longer reached our eyes. There had been no big argument, no betrayal in the usual sense. Just small pieces of love falling apart until nothing was left but silence. The next day, he came home earlier than usual. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. I nodded and sat down. He stood for a while, hands in his pockets, trying to find the right words. "You remember that night when my friends came?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "I wanted them to see what my life has become," he continued. "I wanted them to understand what it feels like to lose connection with someone you once loved more than yourself." His words cut deep. I didn't know what hurt more, the confession itself or the fact that he had used our brokenness as something to show others. Why? I whispered. Why would you do that? He sighed. Because they used to envy me, he said. They thought I had the perfect life. I wanted them to see the truth that love doesn't always last, that sometimes even the best people grow apart. I looked at him, stunned. So you wanted to prove a point? He nodded, his eyes distant. Maybe. Maybe I just wanted to remind myself that I wasn't the only one who failed. I didn't know what to say. My chest felt heavy, my throat tight. I wanted to scream, to cry, to ask him why he hadn't just talked to me instead of turning our pain into a silent show for others. But when I looked at him, I saw nothing but emptiness. His calmness scared me more than any anger ever could. I didn't deserve that, I said finally, my voice trembling. Whatever we went through, you had no right to make it a lesson for others. He looked away. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. But what's done is done. The rest of the evening passed in silence. He sat there, staring at the floor, and I sat across from him, wondering how two people who once shared everything could now share nothing at all. Later, as I walked into the bedroom, I stopped at the doorway and turned to look at him one last time. He was still sitting there, motionless, lost in thought. For the first time, I realized that our story wasn't ending with anger, it was ending with emptiness. I lay in bed, my eyes open to the darkness. For years, I had tried to fix what was broken, to hold on to something that no longer existed. But now, it was clear, love can't survive when trust is gone, and silence can be the loudest kind of betrayal. Outside, the wind rustled softly through the trees. Inside, our home was quiet, too quiet. And in that silence, I finally understood what he meant that night when he said, they needed to see the truth. The truth was simple. Sometimes people stay together not because of love, but because they don't know how to let go. That realization didn't bring peace right away, but it was the beginning of something new, a slow acceptance that not all stories end with forgiveness, and not every heartbreak needs a villain. Some just fade away, quietly, like the sound of footsteps disappearing down an empty hall. The next morning, sunlight crept through the curtains, soft and golden, painting the room in a calm warmth that felt strange after so many cold days. My husband had already left for work, and for the first time in a long while, the house was completely silent. I sat by the window, holding a cup of tea, staring at the street outside, watching people rushing through their lives. It hit me then, life goes on, no matter who decides to stay or walk away. That night's conversation kept echoing in my head. Every word he had said, every look he had given, it all played over and over, like an unfinished song. There was no anger left inside me anymore, just a deep, aching sadness. But beneath that sadness, there was something new, clarity. I finally understood that love doesn't always end with shouting or betrayal. Sometimes it ends quietly, when two people stop trying. Days turned into weeks. We still lived under the same roof, but in silence. He went about his routine, calm and distant, while I began to find small ways to breathe again. I started reading the books I had long ignored, cooking meals for myself, sitting in the garden in the evenings. The world outside our home felt alive, even if my marriage didn't. For the first time, I began to see that peace doesn't always come from fixing what's broken, it comes from accepting that not everything is meant to be repaired. One evening, I found him sitting alone, looking through old photographs. I stood quietly for a moment before speaking. Do you ever miss what we were? I asked. He looked at me, and for the first time in months, his expression softened. Every day, he said. But I don't know how to go back. I nodded slowly. Maybe we're not supposed to, I replied. Maybe this is how it was always meant to end. He didn't argue. He just sat there, silent, and for a brief moment, I saw the man I had once loved, the one who used to laugh freely and hold my hand without hesitation. But the moment passed quickly, like a memory slipping away. A few days later, I packed a small bag. I didn't take much, just a few clothes, some books, and a single framed photo of the two of us from happier times. I left a note on the table, simple and honest. It said, "We both lost something we didn't know how to save. I'm not leaving out of anger, but because I need to find myself again. I hope one day you find peace too." When I stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter, freer. I walked slowly down the street, not knowing where I was headed, but for the first time in a long time, the uncertainty didn't scare me. It felt like the beginning of something new, something I had been too afraid to embrace. In the weeks that followed, I found small joys again. I learned to enjoy my own company, to listen to music, to laugh without reason. Sometimes I thought about him, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Because even though he broke something inside me, he also made me realize my own strength. Looking back, I understood that what happened wasn't about revenge or cruelty, it was about two people lost inside their own silence. He had tried to make others see his pain, but in the end, we both learned that real healing doesn't come from being seen, it comes from letting go. If I were to tell this story now, I would say that it isn't a tale of heartbreak, but of awakening. Because sometimes, the moment you walk away from what hurts you the most is the moment you finally start to live again. As the sun set one evening, I stood by my new window, watching the golden light fade behind the buildings. There was no bitterness left, no tears. Only peace. And in that quiet moment, I whispered softly to myself,